So, we're going to start off with, what are we starting off with? Who's a special, okay? Who's a special is not a complex problem, right? However, we wanted you to use for each, so it became complex all of a sudden, okay? But honestly, for each isn't that big of a deal, right? Who's a special? So who's a special takes what? Is it an array? Yeah, it's an array of special pets, right? So if we were to solve this with a loop, we would set some sort of array or string like concatenator, right? Not a concatenator, but like something to store everything, right? Then we would, in the for loop, we would make the sentence and like plus equal it to the result string, right? We will do the same exact logic with for each, okay? We have let results equal to an empty string, okay? And inside of this result, we will modify this result every time inside of the for each to get us the correct string, okay? Any questions? Does anyone have any questions on why I'm doing this? Okay, so now we can do the for each, right? Special pets dot for each. And what does for each take? What is its argument? It is a function. So I will just do an anonymous function like so, okay? I will make this a tad bigger, and I will move this all the way over, because you don't even really need to see that. Who's a special? Special pets is an array, right? For each is an array method. Special pets dot for each, and if you can see here, I'm passing in a fat arrow function, right? It's just empty, fat arrow, empty, open, close parens, fat arrow, open curly brace, close curly brace. That is the function. So now what for each does for us is that it will automatically pass two things into this function, okay? And that will be the current element, or the current pet, and the index, okay? Any questions? I haven't done anything yet inside of the loop, inside of the for each, because for each what it's really doing is it's looping through the array, right? And it's just calling this function on every element, okay? But the function is up to me. The function I get to decide. I get to write that, okay? So it takes every single element of this special pets array will be a pet, and we also get the index, right? We get the I in the for loop. We always have the I, and we always have array of I, okay? So here we just have pet and index. Nothing fancy.
I just don't follow index exactly. Like how?
For each,
Yeah.
this is a random function that I just made, right?
Correct. Like,
For each passes two things into it. It passes the current element, and it passes the index. That's what for each does.
So like anytime you're writing a for each, there's always two.
There will always be those two things. And if I don't write index here, I mean, I could write whatever here, you know? But if I don't write a parameter here to capture that variable, I cannot use it. Just like any function. If you guys wrote any function and it took no parameters, if you defined a function and took no parameters, and I passed a million things into that, that's fine. Nothing would happen to those things I'm passing in, because your function won't account for it. If you want to account for things being passed into the function, you have to set up your parameters like so. It passes two things into it. Pet will capture the first thing. Whatever will capture the second thing. Pet is the current element. Whatever would be the current index. But naming it whatever doesn't make any sense to me, so I'm just going to call it index, because that's what it's going to be, right? Because that makes sense to me. And I named it pet because it's an array of special pets. This is the current pet, and this is its index. Right? So now we can say results plus equal pet dot name plus the with spaces plus pet dot species plus a string with a space is space very space special exclamation point. Oh, exclamation point. Right? You could do this with the interpolated string with the backticks, but I'm going to do it like this because that's what I chose. Okay? Any questions? So now, in the for each, this string will just be put into here. However, if you did this, you might have been very frustrated and trying to figure out how your sentence does not look like the result sentence that is needed to be, right? And that is because we need a space at the end of here. And so you might have been like, okay, cool, let's put the space there. But this would still fail, right? If I put this here and I ran it like that, this would still fail. Oh, I have to return results. This would still fail. Because it says, Mr. Binns the cat is very special. Oh, the last one has a space too. And, nope, no. So, we have to figure out when and where to put the space at the end of our sentence, right? At the end of the thing we're putting in, right? So we want the space in everywhere except at the end. So, if we just don't put the space in every time, and before the end of the for each block, right, we can just say if index is not equal to special pets dot length, dot length minus 1, then we could do result plus equals the space. So now this, down here we return result. Now this works, right? Because in this code, we add the thing there, and now we have to see if we need the space afterwards, right? So if the current index is not the last index, if we are currently not at the very last element, we need to put a space there so we can add a new sentence, because that's how sentences work, right? We need spaces in between the words. However, we don't want the space at the end, because that would be wrong. So, only if this is true, if the index is not special pets.length minus 1, then we put the space in. Any questions on special pets? Yeah.
Just for practice, how would result plus equals look with interpolation?
Sure. So if you wanted to do interpolation, we would do, well, I'll put results plus equals backticks, right? Backticks, and this is just a string. This is an empty string, right? So the first thing I needed was pet.name, right? So I would do dollar, open curly brace, close curly brace, pet.name. Then, outside of the curly brace, this is now in the string, right? So outside of the curly brace, we would do space, the, space, dollar sign, open curly brace, close curly brace. Inside the curly brace, pet.species. Outside the curly brace, a space is space, very, space, special. And it's that simple. It's the same thing. I will leave it like this so you guys can see. Okay? Sometimes I think it's faster to not do string interpolation because just quickness of typing, like getting the backtick and then the dollar sign is a little funky with the fingers, you know? So I kind of don't really do that much. But sometimes it's just like looks better, you know? Not like a bunch of like plus this, plus that, plus this, plus space. If there's like a lot of like things like this, like plus space the space plus this with a comma space, then it's just like easier to do string interpolation and then put in the variables where you need, because then you could write the sentence as is and then put the variables in later. Just my preference. Any other questions on this? Okay, now I'll show you chain reaction, okay? So chain reaction. So what does this do? So chain reaction is a function, and this function should take a single value and an array of callbacks. So what we want to do is we want to loop through this array of callbacks, pass in that value to that first function, get that value back that it returns, then take that value that was just returned to us and pass it into the next function. And so on, so forth, so on, so forth, until we pass it into the last function, get the value back, and return the end result, okay? So this sounds very confusing, but it really isn't that confusing, okay? And we can solve this using for each very cleanly, okay? And I will do for each to show you guys, just to give you guys a little like extra practice with it, okay? Because for each is very useful, okay? Even though it's kind of annoying and a little hard to wrap your head around right now. But for each is actually very useful and will save you some time, okay? So we will do, all we have to, oh yeah, and this function, you don't, oh yeah, you do have to return the value, never mind. I'm thinking of a different function. So callbacks dot for each, and this will take a function, right? So here I have callbacks dot for each, and I'm passing for each an anonymous function, okay? Is anybody confused by how I'm writing this? Is everyone okay with me writing this? Would you like me to write it a different way? Well, I could just write nope. This would be the other way. I'm throwing in a function with no name. I will leave it like this, because you have the other example up top, okay? So, now, what does for each give to our function that we're writing? What? What does for each give the function that you put into it? The current element and the index, right? In this case, we don't actually need the index, right? We just need the current func. Nope. The current callback. I will call it func. Okay? So, now inside here, we are going to do logic where we pass in the value here into our func, right? So we call func with value. So, we can capture this value like so, right? Because we know each callback inside of that array is going to return us a value. So we capture the value that comes back with this variable temp value, temp val, temporary value. That's why I named it that, okay? So we have that there. And then, since our function is just going to pass in value every time, and value comes from up here, because of scope, can't we just value equals temp val? And then the next iteration, it will pass in temp val, and so on and so forth until we just return value at the end? Right? Like, if we call func with val, and it returns as a value and put it in temp val, and then value up here is now reassigned to temp val, then for each is doing a loop, right? So the next element, func, will be a different function. And what we're doing is we're invoking it with value. But value has changed. we changed it in the previous iteration here. So now value will be different, and we will get the correct thing over and over again until for each is done, value has been changed for the last time, and then we can return value down there. And an even cleaner way to write this is to just not do this, but just do value equals func value. We are reassigning value to the return value of the current function invoked with value. That was a mouthful. But this is all good in the hood. Oh, wait. Did I do something weird? Oh, I didn't copy it. See? I chose to do this in CodePen and show you because these are hard to console log. Any questions on chain reaction? Any questions on chain reaction? It's good.
I just didn't capture it. I don't know if you can explain it a different way.
I will try. So callbacks is an array, right? It's an array of functions, right? So let's not worry about this. Let's worry about this. So for each will loop through that array of functions for us. And it will take each element of that array, which will be a function, and it will throw it into a function that I write, which I did here. Here's an anonymous function, and it's right there. And this func will be each value of callbacks every time. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I'm going to call that function in that point of time, and I'm going to pass in value. That's what I'm doing. That's all I'm doing. And that is going to return me something. I don't care what it is. I'm not interested in what the function's doing. But I just need this value, temp val, okay? Then on the next line, value. What is value? Value is just the parameter up here. Parameters are just variables. You could say that they're similar to let, right? So we can just reassign what that was at any point in time. So that's what I do here. And what am I assigning it to? To temp val, the value we got back from the function. So now, that all happened with the first element of the array. So now we go to the next element of the array. And that is a different function. So we take that value up here and pass it into that function here. But this value, this is a change from when we first called it because we reassigned it in the iteration before, right? So this is a different value now. So we call that, and then we get an even newer value, and we put that in temp val. This is like a loop, right? You can do all of this with a for loop, except this is cleaner with for each because it's this many lines, right? Well, I guess it would be the same amount of lines as a for loop, but like whatever. This is just practice, yeah. So this will go on and on. The reassigning of value, throw it now into func, get it here, reassign it to value, throw this value back into func, and this is always going to change as we go on through the array. Then at the end, when we reassign it and we've gone through the array, value is something completely different than what we started. So we returned it here. Is that a little more clear? Yep. Is that clear? Is that a little clear for everybody?
Do you mind rewriting line 18 with the way that function would have been omitted? Like the even shorter one?
Sure. So I can do that, or I can do callbacks. Or that. Same thing. So all I did
Okay.
was you remove the function keyword, delete it, and then to the right of the parentheses, right? To the right of the parentheses, you just put this fat out.
That's what I thought, but I for some reason kept getting errors. I must have had a mistake on like the parentheses.
This must be something like that.
I think I'm still confused what the func in after the for each parentheses like what is that doing? Like
This is a variable, and I can call that anything. Because when you define functions, you can call parameters anything, right? Because they're variables, and I can call them whatever I want. I can even delete it. However, then I cannot use for each how I need it, right? Because for each takes every element in the array and throws it into my function. But like I said before, you can throw a million things into a function and nothing will happen unless you write parameters to capture them. So that is why we need a parameter here to handle the element that comes through, so that we can capture that element, put it in our own variable in our function definition, and use it down here. Here. Well, now it's not func. Now it's now it's variable. But before it is func, right?
so what func is there is what value called back is up there.
Yes. It is just a parameter. That is all it is.
So that's going to stand for each function within the array.
Yes.
Because that's what you're
Yes.
adding value to. You're feeding value to each function.
Func will change every single time, no matter what we do, since we are using for each. Okay? Value also changes every time because we reassign it here to tempval, which is the value we get back when we invoke func with value. Okay? I guess this is I feel like this problem's a little brain teaser-ish, you know? But as you can see, it is not that bad, writing-wise. How's everybody doing? We doing okay? Should I go into today's lecture? Okay. So, basically, enough of this. So, today's lecture is actually rather short, okay? But it is a little bit confusing. A little bit, okay? And it is building on the topic of how functions are like every other value. You can pass functions into other functions, right? And if you write a function that takes a function, that function you wrote is a higher order function. You can also return functions, right, from functions. I did show you this in the REPL on Thursday, okay? But the main point that I'm going to want to get across to you guys today is this thing called closure. Closure is very important. It's very important for everybody to understand what closure is, okay? And closure defined is the fact that if you had a function, and then inside of that function, you defined another function, right? So think back to scope. Any other function outside of that couldn't access that inner function, right? Because it's defined inside of it. So here, if I say function return name, nope. And then I say let's name equal Marco, and then I have a function over here that's called add last name, and then I say name plus equals space Listenek, and then here I just return name, right? So if you're looking here, the outer function, all it does is it defines a variable name, sets it equal to a string, defines a function, add last name, and then returns name. So if I console.log, let me bring this back. If I console.log return name invoked, we got Marco, right? I also defined a function inside of return name, but I'm not using it. Right? So, what if instead of return name, I returned name in here, and then out here, I return add last name. Okay? So now, if I say let new func equal return name, and then here I console.log new func, I would get a function that's called add last name. Right? Let name equal Marco, I write a function, and I return it inside of this function. So now back to Clojure, right? With this, with what you see here, the fact of Clojure is when new func is assigned to return name invoked, when you invoke a function, that means return name runs, right? Return name runs here, right? Do you guys agree with me? Like when we say let new func equal return name invoked, we have to run to get that variable that is returned from return name, okay? So that means this thing runs, let name equal Marco, define a function, return add last name. Return name is stopped running. When it hits the return keyword, it has stopped running. So if I do console.log new func, and invoke that, how do I get Marco Listening? Why don't I get undefined Listening? And that is Clojure. If Clojure is an inner function, still has access to the outer function's variables, even after the outer function has finished running. Okay? Return name finished running when I assigned it to new func. And name was defined here. Okay? But when I do this, when I run the add last name function, because we return add last name, let me get rid of all these spaces so you guys can see in one thing. Because when you call return name, it returns a function, right? So that means this variable new func is this inner function now. Right? Does that make sense? So since new func is add last name, and we call it here, we invoke it, why this is finished running already? Why is name Marco? It's because of Clojure. You could think of it as being in the point of time when this was defined, and it was referenced to something outside of itself, inside of another function, it still has access to that.
So basically, because you added, you called the return name function, you called that itself, it basically activated the inner function as well.
No.
No.
By calling this, return name is activated. It's invoked, okay? So that means JavaScript will now run this function and it will read all of its inner lines. It declares a name, a variable name, and it's set equal to this string. It also writes a function. add last name, and some stuff inside. Don't worry about it yet. It just defines this. This is just a definition. You do not see add last name being invoked here, right? Add last name is returned. That means that the return value of return name is add last name. It's a function, right? So that means new func is this inner function. So if I don't call new func, and this, let's say this first like console logs running, this won't happen because add last name isn't being called. Add last name is returned from return name, right? So when you call return name, add last name is returned. So that value goes into new func because that's what I'm saying. I'm saying let new func, this variable new func, is now going to be equal to whatever return name returns, which is a function, right? So, since this function is now this function, I can use new func and play with it anywhere I want outside of there. I can call it wherever I want, okay? However, name was defined up here. But I could still access that property down here when I call it. As you can see, markup. What happens if I didn't do that and return name took a parameter? And here I passed in markup. What would happen then? Who thinks something different will happen? Who thinks the exact same thing will happen? You guys are right. The exact same thing will happen because parameters are just variables, right? And you can reassign them, which I'm doing here. And if you thought that just because it wasn't defined in here and closure has no more effect, that is wrong. Closure takes into account the parameters that are defined with return last name. It's just that this is equal to undefined when it was when return name was defined, right? It's just a parameter. It doesn't equal anything until it's run. And it was invoked right there. Yeah.
So the type of new func is undefined?
No, type of new func is function. It is a function. Because even if like we don't pass in Marco here, and now there really is no name, we get the string undefined Listenek, but we're always going to be returning a function. Return name will always return the function. Facts. That is always going to happen. So new func is always going to be a function. Does that make sense?
What if return name didn't return anything? It was just an empty function.
And we tried to call it later?
And checking the.
You tried to do this?
new func.
Well, if I didn't do this, oh wait. Type of new func is undefined, right? Because functions return undefined if you don't implicitly tell it to return something, right? If we returned like an empty array, we would get, oh wait, what am I doing? Hold on. We would get an object because type of an array is an object, right? If we returned hello, you'd get a string. But we don't. We return add last name, which is a function. So we get function. So new func is now a function, and functions can be invoked, like down here. And that's why we get all this stuff. Right? However, let's build off of that. Let's build off of this question. So this is always returning a function, right? I touched on this on Thursday, but what if I did this? What is going to happen? All I did was instead of returning add last name, I returned add last name invoked. So, what, pop quiz, what does return name return? Does it? Yes. Because when we run return name here and we pass in Marco, name is now Marco. We define add last name and then we return add last name, but wait a second, it's invoked. So that means we have to run add last name and find out what that returns. So we run this, Marco plus equals Listenek, console.log running, return name. So this is just going to return my name. But, in my code down here, I'm invoking new func. So when I run this, you see a big error. Because what I just tried to do is I just tried to invoke a string. String. Typo. String. New func. Not a function. New func string. Okay? Yeah.
So why did it change from when you invoke add last name inside the function?
What?
And you call, and you know, why did it change to string instead of function? when you invoke it?
Well, what does add last name return?
The last name plus
The name plus my last name, right? That's what it returns, right? So that means this would be that. When you invoke a function, what that is a return value. It's not the actual function, right? Like, if you were to console log, like, if I was to just, so this runs now, right? But you see here on line 44, like, forget this and forget this. This is the only console log statement now, right? And I get my name, Marco Listenek. But if I don't invoke that, I just get function, right? I'm just returning the function. Console log is just console logging the function, you know? But if you invoke something, the function runs, and we get the value that that function returns. No matter what, we're always going to get something back. Whether it be something that you yourself are returning by the code you're writing, or if you're not returning anything, you will get undefined. Because functions just always return undefined if you tell it to return nothing. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why if I invoke last name here, we get the return value of add last name, and not just the function.
So if you were to just invoke it inside, maybe you I just missed it, and then just call the function, call the name like the variable, it would return the actual name.
Wait, what? If I wanted to what?
So let's say you invoke at last name there, and then you just return new func without invoking it. That should return because the function was already invoked inside.
Wait, I just call it here?
No, on the back where you already did.
Oh, like this?
Yeah. Like
Yeah, then we would get Margulies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, okay, so
So now we are doing this differently. Now we are not expecting new func to be a function. We are expecting this to be the return value, right? Yeah.
You can't remove Marco from the parentheses and do new func parentheses Marco, right?
Oh, like this?
Can you do that?
How it is right now with this? Or back to normal?
Yeah.
Okay, back to normal. And if I passed in Marco down here, I get undefined. Why is that? What is new func?
Return the value goes into name.
Wait, what is new func?
The function return name.
No, it is add last name, right? Because, let me scroll this up a little bit. New func equals return name invoked. So that means new func will be the return value of return name. The return value of return name is add last name. The entire function. So that means that new func has no longer anything to do with return name. It is just add last name. So if I call add last name and I pass in a string, Marco, this doesn't take anything. So then that means that whatever I'm throwing into this function will just be lost. So that means this name up here, look, we didn't pass anything in here, and if you don't pass anything in here, that means the parameters are just undefined, right? So that's why we get undefined here. And you might say, okay, well then let's just do name here, right? And then we get the right thing. However, if then here, I put Marco back up here, I get undefined again. Why is that? This is because of scope. When a function runs, new func is add last name, right? So that function is running. So we see the first thing JavaScript sees when it runs add last name plus equals listener. What is name? Name, we first look inside of this add last name function's local scope. It's function scope, right? And we look for something that is defined as name before we look up a scope. There is something called name here. Its value is undefined, however, it was declared. So we will never look at this. We will always look at this one. Okay? That's where things get a little tricky with closure, okay? Functions, returning functions, both take parameters, okay? Things can get a little tricky. Yeah, what's up?
How do you get that inner function to take the same name from return name?
How do you get this function
To take, yeah, how do you take that name?
like that? Because of closure. That is the whole point of closure, right? Like you don't have to pass this name to add last name. You can just reference it. Because when return name is done running and we return this function, when we run this function, it will still have access to those variables. And that is the whole point. That is the whole point of closure. So,
So if you were to keep name and add last name, like the parameter in there, there was no way to get back Marco.
if I kept name here,
Yeah.
there was absolutely no way Marco would ever be in the picture. Unless we pass something down here. I could pass Steve down here, and then it would be Steve Lee. But that person doesn't exist.
Can we put Steve and just walk it through one more time?
I would
As to the result?
I would love to do that. Look at this. We're going to put Steve here, okay? So now, this is what's going to happen. JavaScript is going to read this file, okay? It's going to go top to bottom, right? Because that's what it does, line by line. It sees this function is being defined, whatever. We go down. We see, okay, let new func. Okay, we're declaring a variable. What is that variable going to be? Return name passed in with a string markup. Everything stops. we have to call return name. We have to find out what new func is going to be. We have to see what return name actually returns, okay? We need that value. And we're going to throw a string into it, because whatever. We're just going to do it. So now we run return name. Name is now equal to Marco, right? This name up here is equal to Marco, right? So we run return name, and add last name here is defined. Do you remember how I said when the JavaScript was reading the file, return name, skip over that, it's just the definition? You can kind of think of this as this happening again, right? This is just a definition. Nothing is being executed. These variables aren't being defined yet, okay? However, I mean, well, whatever. We'll just skip over this for now, okay? So then we return add last name. That function we just defined, we return that. So we got it. We finally got what this thing returns. So now new func is equal to add last name, this function. Is everyone with me? Or is everyone with me? Sort of. So now we can go to line 42. And those are comments. And then more comments. And now we go to line 44. And it sees a console log. JavaScript's like, what are we writing over here? New func, which we defined here, invoked with a string Steve. So JavaScript's like, hold up. What is new func? Well, new func is this function, because that was the return value of returning. So we found this out here, so we know what that is now. So we call new func and pass in Steve. We pass in Steve to add last name. Add last name does not have any parameters, okay? That means you could, yeah.
But new func is return name, so why doesn't it go into return name? Why doesn't Steve go into return name, the return name function?
New func is not return name. New func is add last name.
Oh.
Because new func is equal to return name invoked. And when you equal something to return name invoked, that means we have to run return name and find out what it returns. If it was not equal to return name invoked, then new func would be equal to return name, right? However, that's not what we're doing here. We have to find what this function is returning. And it's returning this function. So now new func is called down here with Steve. However, Steve, there's no other name here, right? So that means we could pass in an array, an object undefined, 7,000, whatever, it doesn't matter. Add last name, doesn't even look at it. So we do name plus equals listener. So what the hell is name then? Name was defined when this function was defined. So it has access to that past value, even though return name has finished running. We already have our return value from return name, but we can still access the name parameter up here, which was Marco. So we do Marco plus equals Listenek, and we return Marco Listenek. That's me. Yes.
So if you put name back into line 32, you get Steve then?
Hell yeah. But that looks weird. So we'll leave mine in. So, if we do this, oh, that didn't work. Wait, what? Oh, name plus equals. Oh. Try to make a quick joke and then just went out of control. But yeah, you see? So now, if I just change the name of that parameter, now I can access both, because they are not called the same thing, okay? Now I can access name up here, because it looks at its inner scope, doesn't find anything called name, so it looks up, right? And name is defined. when I passed it in here. I said this was a little confusing, right?
It's almost about just like the nuance of making sure you're putting those parentheses in to invoke it.
Yeah. Because those are completely different things, right? Like, if you return just the name of the function, you just return the actual data type function of this, right? The definition, the blueprints, right? But if you invoke it, then you just get the return value of that function you're invoking. Different things, okay? So be careful. Slides? Or more questions? Slides? Slides. Tomorrow I will only go over one question, so we have more time for the lecture and workshop. Because tomorrow will be difficult. Anyways, so we have closure. So all I'm going to talk to you about is how you can return functions from functions and what closure actually means and how it is used, okay? So we know that functions can return values, right? Function returns a string, returns I am a string. Let returned value equal returns a string invoked. So console.log return value is I am a string. Everybody's okay with this, right? This makes sense, right? And then on Thursday, we learned that functions are like any other value. So if functions can return values and functions are values, functions can return other functions too, okay? So let's say we have greetMe, and then we have greetMe is a function that just console logs hi, right? It's a completely wasteful, useless function, but that's what it is. Then we have a function getGreeter. GetGreeter returns greetMe, and we're returning the function without calling it. That means we are just returning the entire function, the schematics, the blueprint, okay, of greetsMe. So then, if we say let greeter equal getGreeter invoked, and we console.log type of greeter, and then we console log greeter, and then we invoke greeter, it's a function. It's the function greetMe, and we get hi when we run it. Does this make sense? Does this make sense to everybody? Good. Not that complicated, right? Like, functions are just like any other value, and we can return them. So if we return them and put them in a different value, we can call that value elsewhere, okay? So now, what if we did invoke greetMe? What would the type of greeter be? Undefined. Undefined. Greeter is not a function. So what happens here? When we say let greeter equal getGreeter invoked, the return value of getGreeter is greetMe invoked. So the return value of getGreeter is the return value of greetMe. What are we returning in greetMe? Nada. Nothing. Okay? So that's why this function returns undefined. And that's why the hi is console logged first. Because we had to run this function first to get the return value of greetMe. So we get the console log, and then we get nothing. There's no more code. So this function returns undefined. So that means this function returns undefined. So then type of undefined is undefined. Greeter is undefined, and you can't invoke undefined because it's not a function.
So if function greet me, if after console.log, if then it said return,
What?
like return the answer.
Like what? Like what answer?
Like yeah, like return the variable greet me. Oh, with nothing.
Like return a string?
Yeah.
Like return hi?
Mm-hmm.
Then type of greeter would be string. Console log greeter, it would be hi. Greeter invoked would still throw the error because you cannot invoke strings. Right? Does that make sense? Cool. Does this make sense? You see how just invoking greet me here just ruined everything? It's because returning the actual function schematics versus the return value of that function, meaning when you invoke the function, you return a function invoked, you get completely different things. Like dot pop returns a value, right? But what if you don't invoke it? What would you get? You would get the actual function pop. They're different. Okay? So, if we have getGreeter, what are we doing here? So we have function getGreeter, and we can declare a new inner function and then return it. This is kind of the same thing, right? It's the same thing as the previous slide, but however, greetMe is now defined inside of getGreeter. So we return greetMe, and then greeter, still, we run it, and it's this function, okay? When we say let greeter equal getGreeter invoked, getGreeter returns greetMe, which is here. It was defined here. So that means this is a function, and we invoke it, and we get hi.
Why isn't that undefined though?
Why isn't what undefined? Greet me.
Greeter, when you call greeter,
getGreeter here. Oh, here.
because there's no return in greet me in the function greet me.
Right, but we do console log hi, and that's all we're doing.
But in the previous example, we also console logged hi, and that in turn
This?
made everything undefined, right?
Because we are setting the return value of this to a variable and trying to call that variable. That is different than just calling it. Like here, we are saying return greet me invoked, right? That means this returns the return value of this. So now we're looking for a value. And then greeter here is now going to be that value. And then here we're invoking whatever that was. But that's undefined. Here, we're not doing that. Here, we are not calling greet me ever, except on line 11, when we call greeter. Because here, we don't return greet me invoked. We just return the function. So now this entire function is greeter. So when we call greeter, what does greeter do? All it does is console log. We're not taking the return value. If we said let what is this equal to greeter invoked, what is this would be undefined. But we don't do that. We just call the function. We just run it. And what it does is it just console.logs hi.
Okay.
Right?
So the biggest difference there is that you return greet me.
Yeah. Well, the biggest, yeah. And that we're defining greetme inside of getGreeter now instead of outside. Key takeaways from this slide. Right? Any other questions? Cool. So, this is exactly the same thing. This is exactly the same thing, okay? Except we are not defining greetme before it and then returning the name. We're just returning the function as is here, and it's anonymous. This you can think of as very similar to, instead of saying in a for loop, let current element equal array of I, and then return current element, versus return array of I. This is kind of the same thing as the previous slide and now, right? We are not giving this function that console.logs high a name. We're not defining it up here and then returning it here. We are saving time and we are saving code and just returning the function here without a name. Doesn't matter. It's because technically it's given a name right here, greeter. We say let greeter, a variable, we're declaring it will be equal to the return value of getGreeter. The return value of getGreeter is an anonymous function. So that means greeter is now that function. So if you call greeter, we just get high. Every time we call greeter, we're just going to get high in the console. Any questions? Cool. Yeah.
So if you console log out greeter, just greeter,
Like,
like the variable greeter,
Yeah.
you just get the function name, right?
it would just be like, you know how sometimes when you console log actual functions, it's just like bracket function,
Right.
and then if it has a name, it's like bracket function colon the name.
Yeah. Okay. So
It would just be bracket function.
right. So what if like let greeter equals get greeter invoked? What if that invocation thing, like the parentheses weren't there, and you console log out greeter? It would still be just the definition.
Wait. If what wasn't here?
The
This?
parentheses, yeah.
If this wasn't here, then that means that greeter would then just be get greeter.
It would be the same console log out.
No, it would be function colon get greeter.
Because we're not invoking.
Because we're not getting the return value of get greeter. We're instead copying the schematics over and putting it into this function. So they're the same thing. It's the same thing.
Thanks.
Is everyone doing okay? Alright, whatever. I hope you guys are okay. Just ask me questions if you're not. What if our returned function takes a parameter? So, here, this is the same thing as before, except we're returning function that now this anonymous function takes a name and a console.log is high that name. You don't pass it into getGreeter because as you can see, getGreeter doesn't have a parameter. So even if you did, nothing would happen, right? However, greeter is assigned to the return value of getGreeter because it's assigned to getGreeter invoked. So the return value of getGreeter is this function. And this function does handle a name parameter. So we pass in greeter, Mary, and Rosalind. And so we get hi Mary, hi Rosalind. And then we don't pass in anything, and we get hi undefined. Because if you try to access a parameter and you didn't pass in an argument, then that parameter is set to undefined by default. Right? Cool. This isn't that confusing, right? So now we will get into closure. And this is a little confusing, okay? So let's review how scope works with nested functions. Inner functions can access variables defined in outer functions. You guys did this in the scope workshop, if I recall, right? So like that, right? So like here, greeter, you say let name equal Mary. You define says hi as a function that console.logs hi name, which was Mary, and then you call says hi, right? Here, inside the function. So when you call greeter, all of that runs. So then when you call says hi, name is Mary, right? This makes sense, right? Right, cool. However, closure is the fact that an inner function can still access that name, can still access that variable Mary, after the outer function has finished running, okay? That is what closure is. So like an example of this, the most simple example of this would be this. So let's walk through this slowly, right? Get greeter Okay, so JavaScript reads this file, just a function definition. Then we say let greeter equal get greeter invoked. What is this? What does this do? What does this do? Okay, we have to figure out what this returns, right? Because we have to assign greeter a value. So we have to get a value from this. So we run this. Up, we see the console.log get greeter is running. Then we say, okay, let name equal Mary. Then we say console.log get greeter is finishing. And then we return. Because a function stops when you return, right? And what are we returning? We were returning a function. Console.log hi name. Name is Mary. So then, if you call greeter down here, which is this, you get hi Mary. And that's closure. Okay?
So, get greeter invoked is actually return function.
Yes. The return value of get greeter is this function. However, when we this is number 13. When we pass line 13 and we have the definition for greeter, that means get greeter has finished running, right? But when you call greeter, it still has access to name. And that is closure. And what if getGreeter takes a parameter? So, it's the same thing. I showed you this, right? In the REPL. I showed you this. It is the same thing as saying let name equal Rosalind. However, the name is declared as the parameter of the outer function. And when you pass in Rosalind, when you call getGreeter, that name is now defined as Rosalind. So, when we access it here, after getGreeter is finished running, we still get hi Rosalind, because that is also part of closure. Right? Any questions?
What if Rosalind had been in line 9, just in greeter, but not in line 8?
Then we would get hi undefined. Right? Because then this name was never assigned a value if you didn't pass it in here. Because then this would just be undefined. So then this would just look at that. Yeah.
So if you put you get rid of the name from line 2 and put it in line 3 in the function, and you put greeter Rosalind, you still get hi Rosalind.
Yes. Cool. So, what if both took parameters? Crazy, right? So here, we just have getGreeter, name1, return function, name2, console.log, hi name1, meet name2. We pass Mary when we invoke getGreeter. So now greeter is going to be this function, but name, and then when that happened, name1 was Mary. And then we call greeter, and we pass in Rosalind. So that means name2 is Rosalind. So we get hi Mary, meet Rosalind. This is like a weird combination, right? Any questions? Cool. So this is the exact same function. However, we are just naming them different things, right? Like this is the same function as before, but I'm saying let introduce Mary to get greeter, pass in Mary. Introduce Rosalind to get greeter, pass in Rosalind. Introduce Mary to Dorothy, introduce Mary to Albert, introduce Mary to Rosalind, introduce Rosalind to Barbara, whatever. We get Hi, Mary, Meet Dorothy, Hi, Mary, Meet Albert. And as you can see, what we're writing here, introduce Mary to Dorothy, Hi, Mary, Meet Dorothy. It's very it's very English, right? That's all there is really to this slide. So, we learned about returning functions from functions, and we learned about closure. Any final questions before you take a break and start the workshop and get your hands on this stuff? All right, take a 5-minute break, and I will slack out pairs in 5 minutes. Good job, guys.